The vampire you picture, the pale, charming aristocrat in the cape, was invented by a novelist. The real vampire was a swollen, rotting corpse that terrified villagers dug out of the ground. And what they did to it was the truly horrifying part. So let's start by burying the version you know, because almost none of it is real. The handsome, brooding aristocrat in the high-collared cape, the candlelit castle, the seduction, the elegance, the tragic immortal curse to wander the centuries. All of that came, more or less wholesale, from a single novel written in 1897, and from the films that spent the next 100 years making the monster ever more beautiful. We took something that began as one of the ugliest, most frightening ideas in human history and slowly, lovingly, turned it into a romance. Peel the cape away, and there's no castle underneath, and no charm, and nothing the least bit seductive. There is only a grave, and a body in it that, to the people standing over it, looked horribly like it had been feeding. Because the real vampire was never an aristocrat, and it was never even really a monster in the way we mean the word. It was the recently dead, a husband, a neighbor, sometimes a child, accused of crawling back out of the earth at night to drain the life from the family they'd left behind. And to understand how an ordinary corpse became the most feared thing in a village, you have to understand what these people were actually living through. Because the vampire was never really about the dead at all. It was about the living and the things that were killing them faster than they could possibly explain. Picture a village in Eastern Europe a few hundred years ago, the part of the world where the vampire genuinely comes from, long before any novelist got hold of it. Someone dies. Nothing strange in that. In a world where death was constant and close, they're mourned and washed and buried, and the village moves on. But then, a few weeks later, the dead person's wife begins to weaken. She grows pale and tired and thin. She complains that something sits on her chest at night and presses the breath out of her. She wastes away a little more each day, as though the life were being quietly drawn out of her. And then, before long, she dies too. And then it's the eldest son, and then a grandchild. One after another, the same household, the same slow fading, the same sense of being drained in the dark, until a whole family has been hollowed out, and the village is gripped by a terror it has no way to name. Now remember what these people did not have. They had no idea that disease could pass invisibly from one person to another. They had never heard of a germ, or a contagion, or the simple fact that illnesses like tuberculosis move through a household precisely because those people live together, share the same air, the same bed, the same cup. All they could see was that the dead were dying first, and then dragging the living down into the grave behind them, one by one, in the exact order they'd been closest to the corpse. And so they reached the only conclusion the world had left available to them. The dead were not staying dead. The first one to die was coming back, climbing out of the earth each night to feed on the people it had loved most. That is what a vampire actually was. Not a seducer in a castle. An explanation. The face that frightened, grieving people put onto an invisible plague they could neither see nor stop. But a fear like that does not stay in the mind. It goes looking for proof. And in the case of the vampire, finding the proof meant doing something genuinely unthinkable. It meant going back to the grave and digging the dead person up. And here is where the whole thing tips from tragedy into nightmare. Because when those terrified villagers opened the coffin, what they found seemed to confirm every horror they had imagined. The corpse was not the shrunken, peaceful thing they expected. It was bloated and swollen and full, as though it had been eating well. The skin had darkened to a ruddy, almost living flush. There was fresh blood at the mouth. The hair and the nails looked longer than they had at the burial, as if the body had gone on growing in the dark. And when they moved it, sometimes it made a low groan. To them, this was beyond doubt. This was a creature that had been climbing out at night and gorging itself on the blood of the living, and had only just settled back into its grave before they arrived. We now know that every single one of those signs is simply what a body does as it decomposes. The bloating is gas building up inside. The darkened, ruddy skin and the blood at the lips are the ordinary grim chemistry of decay. The hair and nails only seem longer because the skin around them dries and pulls back. And that terrible groan is nothing but the trapped gas escaping when the body is disturbed. There was no feeding. There was no rising. There was only a corpse, doing exactly what corpses do, being read by people with no other framework as the most damning evidence imaginable. And once they were certain, they set about killing something that was already dead. What they did to those bodies was not random, and it was not cruelty for its own sake. In their minds, it was protection, the desperate, sincere work of people trying to save the rest of their family from a monster. But it is, even now, deeply hard to sit with. They drove stakes down through the corpse, into the heart or the stomach, to pin it into the earth so it could never rise again. And when a stake punctured that gas-filled, decomposing body, it forced the air back out through the throat in a long, wet groan, which the villagers heard, unmistakably, as the vampire crying out as it died a second time. The blood and fluid that welled up around the wound only confirmed it. They had heard it scream. They had seen it bleed. What more proof could anyone need? Some bodies were beheaded and the head buried separately or placed down between the corpse's feet so that it could never find its way back. Some had the mouth packed with garlic or stuffed with a stone. And in some places a brick was wedged between the jaws quite deliberately, on the logic that a vampire kept busy gnawing on a brick for eternity was a vampire that wasn't out drinking the blood of the living. Some were turned face down in the grave, so that if they did try to claw their way upward, they would only dig themselves deeper into the earth. And some, in the end, were simply hauled out and burned to ash, because fire was the one thing everyone could agree a vampire would not survive. And these were not rare, isolated horrors, told around a fire and exaggerated in the retelling. They were documented, investigated, written up, and argued over by educated men who did not know what to make of them. In the early 1720s, in the Serbian village of Kiseljevo, a man named Peter Plogojevic died and was buried, and within days 9 other villagers had sickened and died, each of them insisting on their deathbed that Plogojevic had come to them in the night. When Austrian officials had his grave opened, they recorded what they found in sober, careful detail. A body that had barely decayed, fresh blood about the mouth, hair and nails that seemed to have grown. And, unable to explain any of it, they had the corpse staked and burned. A few years later came another case, a former soldier named Arnold Paula, whose exhumation produced the very same signs and the very same conclusion, and whose report was sent all the way to Vienna. It was those official accounts, passed from hand to hand across Europe, that carried the word vampire into the wider world for the first time. The legend we now think of as pure fiction began its life as a government paperwork problem, a thing serious people genuinely tried to prove was real. And if you think this was something that only happened long ago, in far-off villages, in a more superstitious age, it wasn't. Because the very same thing was happening in New England, in the United States, as recently as the 1800s. There, a wave of tuberculosis was moving through rural families exactly as it always had. Slowly, invisibly, household by household, the dead seeming to pull the living down after them. And the terrified families reached for the very same explanation their ancestors had, an ocean away and a century earlier. They dug up their own dead daughters and sisters. They examined the bodies for that telltale fresh blood. And when they found it, they cut out the hearts and burned them, and sometimes had the sick survivors breathe the smoke or swallow the ashes in the hope of breaking the curse. The most haunting of them all was a young woman named Mercy Brown. Her family in Rhode Island had already buried a mother and a daughter to consumption, and now the last surviving son, Edwin, was wasting away from the very same disease. So when neighbors became convinced that one of the dead Browns was feeding on him from beyond the grave, his father, George, exhausted and desperate, finally agreed to let them dig. They opened the graves in the winter of 1892. Mercy, who had died most recently and been kept in the cold, was barely decomposed. And to the crowd gathered at the graveside, that stillness looked like proof. They cut out her heart and burned it on a rock beside the grave and fed the ashes to her dying brother in the hope it would cure him. Edwin died 2 months later regardless. The disease, of course, had never once been in the grave. It had been in the lungs and in the shared air the whole time. And a father had been driven to burn his own daughter's heart, chasing a monster that was never there. That is the real vampire. Not a creature of the night, but a measure of how far ordinary, loving people will go with the very best of intentions when grief and terror collide with a thing they cannot begin to explain. So why then does the vampire endure? Why has it outlived the plagues and the panics that created it and clawed its way into every story we tell? Part of the answer is simply that the fear underneath it never left us. The vampire was always the dread of something that should be over and gone, and isn't. The dead who won't stay buried, the loss that keeps taking, the sickness that moves through the people you love no matter what you do. Strip away the centuries of velvet and candlelight, and that is still the cold thing beating at the center of it. The horror of watching the people closest to you fade, one after another, and being powerless to understand why. And there is something else, something quieter and stranger. We did not just preserve the vampire, we fell in love with it. We took the most frightening idea our ancestors had, the returning, hungry dead, and we slowly turned it into the thing we now find seductive, immortal, even enviable. We made the monster beautiful. Perhaps because somewhere underneath the fear, the vampire offers the one thing every human being has secretly wanted since the very beginning. The thing those grieving villagers were really fighting against when they dug up their dead. The refusal to stay dead. The promise that death is not, after all, the end. We were never really afraid of the vampire. We were afraid of what it knew. If this version of the vampire made your blood run cold, leave a like. It genuinely helps these darker, truer stories find the people who'd want to hear them. Subscribe to Mythical Curiosity, because there are so many more monsters like this one, each of them hiding a truth far stranger than the legend we were handed. And tell me in the comments which myth, which monster, which buried piece of history you'd like me to dig back up next. Some graves don't stay closed. I'll see you there.